Nathan Jennings stood in the main office of his inherited janitorial supply company, staring at the latest financial report with a deep frown. Profits were steady, but customer complaints had tripled in the last 6 months. Staff turnover was at an all-time high, and there were whispers that some locations were barely holding things together. He had taken over the company after his father's passing 2 years ago, but with 12 locations spread across the state, he had never personally met most of the employees. His father had built the business from the ground up, but Nathan had grown up more focused on the numbers rather than the people. He trusted his district managers to handle operations, but now, after months of bad reports, he wasn't so sure. "I need to see what's really going on," Nathan muttered. His assistant, Kelly Grant, looked up from her tablet. "Are you thinking about going undercover?" Nathan nodded. "It's the only way I'll get the truth. I want to see how employees are treated, how managers run their stores, and what's really happening on the ground." Kelly hesitated. "You've never done anything like this before. What if they recognize you?" "They won't," Nathan said. "Most of them have never seen me in person. I'll grow out my beard, wear glasses, change my hair. No one will suspect a thing." After a few days of preparation, Nathan transformed himself. His clean-cut look was replaced with scruffy facial hair, thick-rimmed glasses, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He wore baggy work clothes and steel-toed boots, just another laborer looking for a job. He applied at one of his struggling locations under the name Nate Johnson. The store's manager barely glanced at his application before handing him a mop and bucket. "We've been short-staffed for months," the manager, a stocky man named Greg, said with a sigh. "The last janitor walked out last week. Think you can handle it?" Nathan nodded. "Yeah, no problem." The first few hours were eye-opening. The store was a mess: dusty shelves, overflowing trash bins, and dirty floors that hadn't seen a mop in days. He could tell that employees were overworked, moving frantically to keep up with demands. Customers complained about slow service, and the tension in the air was thick. He worked quietly, watching and listening. The assistant manager, a sharp-eyed woman named Lisa, was doing her best to keep things under control, but Greg was barely involved. He spent most of his time in the back, only stepping out when a major issue arose. While scrubbing a spill near the loading dock, Nathan noticed an older man cleaning the back hallway. The janitor, a wiry man in his 60s named Henry, worked with quiet efficiency, moving faster than someone half his age. He noticed Nathan watching and chuckled. "New guy, huh?" "Yeah," Nathan said. "First day." Henry nodded. "Stick close to me. I'll show you the ropes." Nathan followed Henry through the store, learning the routines and listening to him talk. Henry had been with the company for over 20 years, but he wasn't bitter like some long-time employees. He cared about the store and the people in it. "Management's been rough lately," Henry admitted while refilling a mop bucket. "Greg doesn't do much. Lisa tries, but it's hard when you don't have support. Feels like no one up top cares anymore." Nathan felt a pang of guilt. He had been one of those people sitting in an office, disconnected from the reality of daily operations. As the day wore on, Nathan started noticing more issues. Employees were exhausted, working long hours with little recognition. Stock deliveries were constantly late, forcing workers to scramble. And Greg? He spent most of his time on his phone, barely acknowledging problems as they arose. Nathan knew he needed more time to observe before making any decisions. But one thing was clear: this store was struggling, and leadership was failing. And then, everything changed in an instant. Nathan was cleaning a high shelf in the storage room when the ladder beneath him wobbled. He grabbed for stability, but the metal frame tilted dangerously. His heart pounded as he felt himself losing balance. Then, strong hands grabbed him. "Gotcha!" Nathan gasped as Henry pulled him back, just in time. The ladder clattered to the ground, but Nathan was safe. He looked at Henry, shaken. Thank you." Henry clapped him on the back. "Careful, kid. These old ladders ain't what they used to be." Nathan's heart was still racing. If Henry hadn't been there, he could have been seriously hurt or worse. He stared at the older man, realizing something important. Henry wasn't just a janitor. He was the backbone of this store, holding it together when no one else seemed to care. Nathan had come undercover to see the truth, and now he had found it. Nathan's hands were still shaking slightly as he stepped off the ladder, his heart pounding in his chest. Henry gave him a steady look before bending down to check the ladder's hinges. The metal frame groaned as he pressed on it, and his expression darkened. "This thing should have been replaced months ago," Henry muttered under his breath. He ran a calloused hand along the rusted joints before shaking his head. Someone's gonna get hurt if they don't start fixing things around here. Nathan clenched his jaw. That was exactly the kind of negligence that had been bleeding into the company, and now he had seen it firsthand. If something as basic as equipment maintenance was being ignored, what else had been neglected? Before he could dwell on it, the stockroom door swung open with force, and Greg stomped in. His gaze flicked between the fallen ladder and Nathan standing beside it. What the hell happened here? Greg's tone was sharp, more irritated than concerned. Henry straightened. Ladder's faulty. Almost sent the kid to the floor. Greg barely spared a glance at Nathan before waving a dismissive hand. Well, don't use it if it's broken. Nathan bit the inside of his cheek. That was it? No effort to remove it, no immediate action to replace it? Henry's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't argue. Instead, he nudged the ladder aside with his foot and turned back to his work. Nathan followed his lead, though the encounter left a bitter taste in his mouth. The rest of the shift passed with more observations Nathan couldn't ignore. Employees moved through their shifts with weary efficiency, their conversations tinged with frustration. Supplies were often misplaced, forcing workers to waste time searching instead of assisting customers. The break room was in disrepair, with a coffee machine that sputtered more than it brewed and chairs that wobbled under the slightest movement. It wasn't just a staffing issue, it was a leadership issue. Nathan saw Lisa handling most of the real work, stepping in to assist employees whenever they were overwhelmed. She reorganized misplaced inventory, dealt with customer complaints personally, and even handled the register when things got busy. But no matter how much she did, Greg remained detached, spending more time in his office than on the floor. By the time the shift ended, Nathan's muscles ached from the constant movement. He had never spent this much time on his feet, scrubbing floors, hauling boxes, and cleaning up after others. It was exhausting, but it was also revealing. As he stepped outside, Henry was locking up a side entrance. He glanced at Nathan, then gave a small nod toward the parking lot. Walk with me. Nathan fell into step beside him, the evening air cool against his skin. You got the look of a man who's seeing things for the first time, Henry said, his voice low and knowing. Nathan hesitated. He had to be careful, just noticing how things run. Henry exhaled through his nose. Figured. Most new hires either don't care or quit after a few weeks. He shot Nathan a sideways glance. You pay attention. Nathan didn't respond immediately. He had spent years managing this company from a distance, relying on reports and numbers to tell him how things were going. But numbers didn't show broken ladders, exhausted employees, or a manager who barely lifted a finger. Henry continued. Been here a long time. Seen good management, bad management. Right now. He shook his head. This ain't good. Nathan studied him in the dim light of the parking lot. There was no bitterness in Henry's voice, just quiet disappointment. They reached an old truck, paint fading along the edges. Henry pulled open the door, but paused, looking at Nathan one last time. You'll learn quick, he said. Either you do the work, or you watch others suffer for it. With that, he climbed in and drove off, leaving Nathan standing there, his mind racing. He had come undercover to see if the complaints were exaggerated. Now he knew they weren't, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. Nathan arrived early the next morning, blending into the rhythm of the store as if he had been working there for weeks. He kept his head down and observed, noting every inefficiency, every crack in the system that upper management had failed to see. The employees were showing up on time, putting in effort, but they were running on fumes. Lisa was already at the front, answering a customer's question about a delayed order while simultaneously coordinating with an employee restocking shelves. She barely had a moment to breathe before the phone rang again. Greg, as expected, remained in his office. Nathan worked alongside Henry in silence for a while, sweeping under the aisles and emptying trash bins. He could feel the weight of what he had seen settling into his chest. The store wasn't just struggling, it was being held together by a few people who actually cared while the person in charge ignored the problems. By midday, a delivery truck arrived with a shipment that was long overdue. Nathan followed Lisa to the back to help unload, but the moment the driver stepped out, his frustration was obvious. You're 2 weeks behind on invoices, the man said, handing over a clipboard. I was told I needed to get a signature before I can even unload. Lisa frowned, scanning the paperwork. We should be up to date. Let me check on this. Nathan watched as she disappeared into the office. A few minutes later, she emerged, her expression tight. Greg hasn't processed any payments in over a month, she muttered under her breath. I don't know what he's doing back there, but he's not running this store. Nathan's jaw tensed. He had suspected Greg was incompetent, but this was worse. He wasn't just lazy, he was actively neglecting responsibilities that were essential to keeping the store running. Lisa turned to the driver, apologizing for the inconvenience, and promised to have the payments sorted by the end of the day. Nathan helped unload the shipment, noticing how Henry moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. As they worked, Nathan leaned in slightly. How long has Greg been like this? Henry didn't answer right away. He pulled a box off the truck and set it down before finally responding. Long enough. He wasn't always this bad, but once your dad passed, he stopped trying. No accountability. Nathan absorbed that. His father had built this company on hard work and integrity, but now, parts of it were crumbling under poor leadership. By the time the last box was stacked, Lisa had managed to process the payment. The driver left, though not before shaking his head and muttering about how disorganized things had become. Nathan knew then that he had seen enough. His original plan was to stay undercover a little longer, but this couldn't wait. That evening, after most of the employees had clocked out, Nathan stepped out of the stockroom and walked straight toward Greg's office. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, Greg was leaned back in his chair, scrolling through his phone. Nathan knocked once before stepping in. Greg barely looked up. What do you want? Nathan took off his glasses, pulled off his cap, and let his true expression settle onto his face. Greg's eyes narrowed in confusion, but then realization hit. He sat up abruptly, his posture stiffening, but he didn't speak. Nathan closed the door behind him. I own this company, he said, his voice steady. And I've just spent the last few days watching you let it deteriorate. Greg swallowed hard. Nathan cut him off. No excuses. I've seen it all. The missed payments, the neglected employees, the fact that Lisa is basically running this store while you sit in here doing nothing. You've failed as a leader, and I won't let this continue. Greg's face turned red. It's not that simple. We've been understaffed, corporate hasn't. Nathan shook his head. I am corporate, and I'm telling you, this is unacceptable. Greg looked away, jaw tight. He knew there was no talking his way out of this. Nathan exhaled, steadying himself before speaking again. Effective immediately, you're done here. I'll be bringing in someone who actually cares about this store and the people working in it. For a long moment, Greg didn't move. Then, without another word, he stood up, grabbed his things, and walked out. Nathan stepped out of the office and called Lisa over. When she approached, wary, he gave her a small nod. I'm Nathan Jennings, he said. The owner. Her eyes widened, but she didn't speak. I've been working here undercover to see what's really going on, he continued. And what I've seen is that this store is being held together by people like you and Henry while Greg has been failing everyone. Lisa let out a slow breath. So, what happens now? Nathan met her gaze. Now we fix it. Lisa's expression remained unreadable as she processed Nathan's words. She had spent months trying to keep the store afloat, and now the truth was laid bare. The owner himself had seen everything. She folded her arms, her posture tense, but her voice was steady when she finally spoke. What exactly do you mean by fix it? Nathan didn't hesitate. Greg is gone. That's the first step. But that's not enough. This store needs real leadership, and I saw firsthand that you've been the one holding things together. I want to make things right, starting with promoting you to store manager. Lisa's brows lifted slightly, but she didn't look surprised, just cautious. And what happens after that? A title change doesn't fix everything. Nathan nodded. You're right. The store is understaffed, the equipment is falling apart, and morale is low. I'm bringing in immediate reinforcements. We'll start by hiring more people so no one is forced to do the job of 3 employees. I'm also authorizing a full maintenance review. That broken ladder should have never been in use. I'll be making sure corporate provides the resources this store actually needs. Lisa studied him carefully, arms still crossed. And what about Henry? He's been here longer than anyone, and he's the reason a lot of us haven't walked out. Nathan met her gaze. I know. He saved me from that fall, and I've watched him work. He's invaluable. He exhaled, already knowing what needed to be done. I want to meet with him personally. He deserves more than what he's been given. Lisa's stance relaxed slightly, but her expression remained firm. Then let's talk to him now. Nathan followed her to the stockroom, where Henry was finishing up his shift. The older man was wiping down a set of shelves, his movements as efficient as ever. When he noticed them approaching, he set the rag aside and gave them a questioning look. "Nate," Henry greeted, then glanced at Lisa. "Something going on?" Nathan took a step forward. "My name isn't Nate. It's Nathan Jennings. I own this company." Henry's face remained neutral for a long moment, his sharp eyes scanning Nathan as if searching for any sign of dishonesty. Then, instead of shock or anger, a slow nod followed. "Knew there was something different about you," Henry said. "Didn't know you were the boss, but I could tell you weren't just another new guy." Nathan almost laughed at the directness of the statement, but he kept his focus. "I came undercover because I needed to see for myself what was happening in my stores. And I saw a lot. I saw how bad leadership let this place fall apart. I saw how employees were stretched thin. And I saw how you, more than anyone, kept things running." Henry shrugged slightly. "Just doing my job." Nathan shook his head. "No, you've been doing far more than that. You've been keeping this store together when no one else would. That shouldn't be your responsibility alone, and I won't let it continue like this." He took a breath before continuing. "I want to offer you a senior position overseeing training for all janitorial staff across our locations. You'd have control over hiring, equipment maintenance, and making sure no store is left to fend for itself." Henry's eyes narrowed slightly, not with skepticism, but with careful consideration. "That's a big change." Nathan nodded. "It is. But it's one that needs to happen. You've been here for over 20 years, and that experience is invaluable. If you take this, you won't just be cleaning floors, you'll be making sure every store has the resources and support they need." Henry was silent for a long moment, his fingers tapping lightly against the shelf. Then, he gave a small nod. "If it means making sure no one else has to deal with what we've been dealing with here, then yeah, I'll do it." Relief settled into Nathan's chest. This was how things changed, by putting the right people in the right places, by recognizing those who had been overlooked. Lisa exhaled, her expression softer now. "So, when do we start?" Nathan smiled slightly. "Immediately." The next few days were a whirlwind of changes. Staffing adjustments were made, with additional hires approved to lighten the workload. Equipment inspections were scheduled, ensuring that no other store was relying on broken tools. Henry was officially placed in his new role, already drafting plans for training programs. When Nathan returned to the store later that week, he found employees moving with renewed energy. There was still work to be done, but the difference was clear. People finally felt heard. As he walked through the aisles, Lisa approached, holding a clipboard. "Thought you'd disappeared for a bit," she said, though there was no accusation in her tone. "Had to make sure every store was getting the same attention," Nathan replied. "This wasn't just a one-time fix." Lisa nodded approvingly. "Good. Because people need to know they're not being forgotten." Nathan turned slightly, spotting Henry near the front, speaking with one of the newer employees. The older man was demonstrating something with practiced ease, his presence steady and reassuring. Nathan had come undercover searching for the truth. What he found was a failing system, but more importantly, he found the people who refused to let it crumble. And now, he would make sure they never had to fight that battle alone again. Nathan sat in the break room, a stack of reports spread out in front of him. The past week had been a whirlwind of changes, but the real challenge was making sure they lasted. He had seen too many businesses implement quick fixes only to slide back into old habits. That wasn't going to happen here. Lisa walked in, a folder tucked under her arm. She pulled out a chair and sat across from him, setting the folder down with a quiet tap. "The hiring process is moving faster than I expected," she said. "We've already brought in 3 new employees, and I've got interviews lined up for 2 more. Nathan nodded, flipping through the documents. The new hires weren't just bodies to fill shifts. They were carefully chosen to bring balance to the team. Overworked employees made mistakes, and mistakes led to more problems down the line. Lisa leaned back slightly, watching him. "I've been thinking about something," she said after a moment. "You've been hands-on with all of this, but what happens when you leave? A lot of owners step in for a little while, then disappear again." Nathan closed the folder, considering her words carefully. He had no intention of slipping back into distant oversight, but proving that was something that would take time. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, "but I know words don't mean much until there's proof. That's why I'm setting up regular check-ins, not just here, but with every store. Managers will have direct access to me when they need it." Lisa studied him, as if weighing whether she believed him. Then she gave a small nod. "Good, because for a long time, It felt like no one was listening. Nathan understood that more than he had before. It was one thing to read reports, it was another to be in the middle of it, to see the exhaustion on employees' faces, to hear the frustration in their voices. Before Lisa could say more, Henry stepped into the break room, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked between them, then pulled out a chair and sat down. Just check the supply inventory, Henry said. Looks like we've still got some gaps. Cleaning solutions running low, and the mop heads we just got in are the wrong type. Someone's been ordering the cheapest options instead of what actually works. Nathan frowned. That was another problem he hadn't noticed before: cost-cutting in the wrong places. Who's been handling supply orders? He asked. Lisa pulled out her phone, scrolling through a list. Looks like it's been a mix. Greg handled some, but corporate's been pushing for cheaper alternatives across multiple locations. Probably looked good on paper. Nathan exhaled. We're changing that. No more cutting corners on the things that actually matter. I'll make sure corporate knows what's needed instead of just approving the lowest bidder. Henry gave a satisfied nod. Good. Because those mop heads they sent us might as well be rags tied to sticks. Lisa's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it before standing. I've got to take this. One of the new hires has a question about the closing routine. Nathan watched as she left, then turned to Henry. How's the transition been for you? Adjusting to the new role? Henry leaned back slightly, crossing his arms. Different, but not bad. Lot more meetings than I'm used to, but if it means getting things done, I'll deal with it. I've been visiting other stores, seeing what they're dealing with. Some places are in worse shape than this one was. That didn't surprise Nathan. The issues here weren't isolated. They were symptoms of a larger problem. Henry continued, his tone thoughtful. Some managers are trying, but they don't have the support. Others? They're just like Greg, collecting a paycheck and letting things fall apart. Nathan absorbed that. Fixing one store was a start, but the real work was making sure every location improved. I want your recommendations, Nathan said. You've seen more than I have. Which stores need immediate attention? Henry nodded, pulling a small notepad from his pocket. He flipped through a few pages before setting it on the table. These 3, he said, tapping the list. Same problems we had here: lack of leadership, bad equipment, employees getting burned out. Nathan studied the names. He recognized them, but had never looked at them beyond the financial reports. That was going to change. I'll start making visits next week, Nathan said. This isn't just about fixing problems, it's about making sure they don't happen again. Henry gave a small grunt of approval. Then you're on the right track. Nathan knew there was still a long road ahead. A company didn't change overnight. But this was the first time in a long time that things were moving in the right direction. And this time, he wasn't going to lose sight of what mattered.